April 1945. Wehrmacht auxiliaries trembled in an Ohio processing center, certain their propaganda had told the truth about American brutality, when a U.S. Army medical officer ordered, "Show us your feet." They braced for humiliation. What happened next defied everything they'd been taught about the enemy, and revealed a weapon more powerful than any bomb, the strategic compassion that would reshape post-war Europe and win the peace that followed victory. April 15th, 1945, 08:47 hours. Camp Perry, Ohio. Temperature, 56 degrees. The wind carried the smell of Lake Erie across the processing yard, where 247 German women stood in formation, exhausted from the transatlantic crossing that had taken them from the ruins of the Third Reich to the American heartland. They were Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, military auxiliaries who had operated radar stations, encrypted communications, and coordinated logistics for the German military machine. Now they were prisoners of war on American soil, the first large group of German women POWs to be processed at this inland facility. Hauptgefreite Margarete Hoffmann, 23, from Stuttgart, stood in the third row. Her feet ached from standing. Her uniform was filthy from weeks without proper washing. Her mind raced with images from the propaganda films she'd watched throughout the war. American soldiers portrayed as brutal savages who showed no mercy to prisoners, particularly women. "The Americans will violate the Geneva Convention," her commanding officer had warned before the surrender. "They will humiliate you. They will worse." The processing facility at Camp Perry had been hastily converted from a National Guard training center into a POW intake station. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows behind chain-link fencing. American flags snapped in the April wind. Armed guards stood at intervals, their M1 Garand rifles held at parade rest. The German women waited, watching American personnel move with casual efficiency that contradicted everything they'd been taught about American disorganization and incompetence. Captain Robert Morrison, 34, from Philadelphia Medical Corps, reviewed the processing checklist on his clipboard. A graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, he'd spent 3 years treating combat casualties in North Africa, Sicily, and France. He'd seen what war did to bodies and minds. He understood that these women, despite wearing enemy uniforms, were human beings who required medical screening according to U.S. Army regulations and Geneva Convention protocols. His orders were explicit: process all POWs through medical examination, identify health concerns, provide treatment for acute conditions, and establish baseline health records. The strategic situation that brought these women to Ohio was unprecedented in American military history. By April 1945, the Allied advance had captured hundreds of thousands of German military personnel. Among them were approximately 15,000 women who had served in various auxiliary roles. The question of how to process, house, and eventually repatriate these women presented both logistical and diplomatic challenges. The U.S. War Department understood that treatment of German POWs would directly influence post-war reconstruction efforts and shape European perceptions of American values. Margaret watched Captain Morrison approach the formation. He stopped, consulted with the camp commander, then turned to address the assembled prisoners through an interpreter. His voice was measured, professional, devoid of the theatrical cruelty she'd expected. "You will undergo medical processing," the interpreter translated. "This is mandatory under international law and U.S. military regulations. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. We will begin with foot inspections." The words "foot inspections" rippled through the formation like electricity. Margaret felt her stomach clench. This was it, the humiliation they'd been promised, disguised as medical procedure. Around her, women exchanged terrified glances. Some began to cry quietly. Others stood rigid, determined to face whatever degradation awaited with whatever dignity they could maintain. What none of them understood, what their propaganda had deliberately obscured, was the genuine strategic crisis that U.S. medical personnel had identified during POW processing operations across Europe. Trench foot, frostbite damage, and fungal infections had reached epidemic proportions among German military personnel during the final months of the war. Untreated, these conditions could spread rapidly through POW camps, creating public health disasters that would strain already overtaxed medical resources. The foot inspections weren't about humiliation, they were about preventing medical catastrophe. But Margaret didn't know this. Neither did the 246 other women standing in formation. They only knew fear as Captain Morrison gave the order that would begin an unexpected transformation. First row, step forward, remove your boots. Show us your feet. The first woman removed her boots with trembling hands. Her feet were white, wrinkled from weeks of constant dampness, the skin peeling in layers. The smell of infection filled the immediate area, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. Captain Morrison knelt beside her, pulled on latex gloves, and began his examination with the same clinical precision he'd applied to treating wounded American soldiers. Severe trench foot, stage 3. He noted to the medic recording findings. Fungal infection, bilateral, immediate treatment required. What happened next would later be documented in Army Medical Corps records as a case study in field medical efficiency operating under unprecedented humanitarian constraints. Captain Morrison didn't lecture the woman about hygiene. He didn't use her condition as an excuse for punishment or ridicule. Instead, he issued immediate orders. Clean, dry socks, antifungal powder, daily foot washing stations, elevation protocol. Follow up in 48 hours. The medic, Private First Class James Chen, 21, from San Francisco, whose parents had immigrated from China in 1920, handed the German woman a paper bag containing clean white cotton socks, a small tin of medicated powder, and a printed instruction sheet in German explaining proper foot care procedures. Private Chen had spent the past 6 months processing POWs at various camps. He'd developed a routine that balanced military efficiency with basic human decency, understanding that his role was to implement U.S. policy while maintaining the moral high ground that differentiated American conduct from enemy practices. Margaret watched this interaction with profound confusion. The propaganda had prepared her for brutality, not medical treatment. Her turn came 20 minutes later. She removed her boots with shaking hands, revealing feet in similar condition, the skin macerated, toes reddened with early infection, toenails darkened from trauma. She kept her eyes downcast, waiting for the mockery or violence that never came. Instead, Captain Morrison conducted the same thorough examination, his touch professional and impersonal. Trench foot, stage 2, he dictated. Mild fungal infection, standard treatment protocol. He looked up at her face for the first time. When did you last have dry socks? The interpreter translated. Margaret's voice was barely audible. February. 3 months in wet boots, Morrison noted. You're lucky you still have your toes. We'll get you fixed up. The processing continued throughout the morning. Of the 247 women examined, 189 showed signs of trench foot ranging from mild to severe. 76 had active fungal infections. 23 required immediate intensive treatment to prevent permanent tissue damage. 4 showed signs of frostbite injury, sustained during the brutal winter of 1944 to 45. The medical personnel worked with systematic efficiency, treating each woman according to the same protocols they'd apply to American personnel. By noon, a transformation was occurring that extended beyond medical treatment. The women had been issued clean uniforms, not German military attire, but simple work clothes in navy blue. They'd been directed to barracks where beds had clean sheets, where windows opened to fresh air, where temperatures were maintained at comfortable levels. They'd been served lunch in a mess hall where the food, though institutional, was hot, plentiful, and nutritious. Bread, soup, vegetables, coffee. No one monitored their portions. No one denied them seconds. Margaret sat at a wooden table with 5 other women from her unit. They ate in silence, processing the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. The propaganda had promised starvation. They were being fed. The propaganda had promised violation. They'd received medical treatment. The propaganda had promised American barbarism. They'd encountered American efficiency, tempered by institutional compassion. The strategic implications of this approach were being calculated in offices far from Camp Perry. War Department officials understood that word would spread through Red Cross communications, through eventual repatriation, through the international press monitoring POW treatment. How America treated German prisoners would directly influence post-war European attitudes toward American occupation, toward democratic reconstruction, toward acceptance of U.S. leadership in rebuilding shattered nations. Every act of basic decency was both morally correct and strategically calculated. That afternoon, medical personnel established foot-washing stations in each barracks, simple arrangements of basins, soap, clean towels, and drying racks for wet boots. Women were instructed on proper hygiene protocols through printed materials and interpreter-led demonstrations. The approach was practical, stripped of moral judgment, focused on preventing the spread of infection throughout the camp population. Margareta participated in the evening foot-washing routine, following instructions that seemed absurdly mundane given the context. She dried her feet carefully, applied the antifungal powder, put on the clean cotton socks that felt like luxury against skin that had known only dampness for months. Around her, other women followed the same routine. Some cried quietly, tears of relief, confusion, exhaustion. Others maintained stoic silence, unwilling to acknowledge the kindness they'd received from the enemy they'd been taught to hate. As night fell over Camp Perry, Margaret lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Her feet hurt less than they had in months. Her stomach was full, the barracks were warm. Everything she'd believed about the Americans had been systematically dismantled in a single day, not through propaganda or persuasion, but through the simple act of treating prisoners as human beings deserving of basic care. May 1945. German High Command remnants receiving Red Cross reports from POW camps expressed open confusion about American procedures. Wehrmacht intelligence analysts reviewed testimony from repatriated prisoners, searching for evidence of coercion or psychological manipulation that might explain reports of humane treatment. They found none. The reports were consistent, detailed, and deeply troubling to officers who had built careers on assumptions about American military incompetence and moral weakness. Colonel Hans Dietrich, Wehrmacht intelligence officer operating from a temporary facility in Bavaria before his own surrender, read through intercepted communications with increasing frustration. "They are feeding them properly," one report stated. "Medical treatment exceeds Geneva Convention minimum requirements. Prisoners report no physical abuse. Morale among captured personnel improving despite defeat." The implications were devastating. If American treatment of prisoners exceeded German treatment of its own soldiers during the war's final months, what did that reveal about the ideological foundations the Wehrmacht had defended? The philosophical contradiction was profound. Nazi ideology had portrayed Americans as culturally inferior, a mongrel nation of weaklings incapable of sustained military effort or moral purpose. Yet the evidence from POW camps told a different story: systematic efficiency in administration, institutional commitment to humane treatment, and pragmatic compassion that served both moral and strategic purposes. American forces had demonstrated capability to project overwhelming military power while simultaneously maintaining ethical standards that the Wehrmacht had abandoned in pursuit of victory. Captain Morrison's medical unit documented outcomes that validated the humanitarian approach. Within 3 weeks of the initial foot inspections, infection rates among German women POWs at Camp Perry had dropped by 78%. Serious cases requiring intensive treatment decreased from 23 to 4. 0 prisoners experienced permanent tissue loss due to untreated trench foot or frostbite complications. The medical intervention had prevented a potential epidemic while demonstrating American institutional capacity for mass medical care under challenging conditions. But the impact extended beyond medical statistics. Margaret found herself assigned to work details within the camp, laundry operations serving the POW population. The work was structured, supervised, and compensated with camp credits that could be used for small purchases from the commissary. Cigarettes, soap, writing paper, minor personal items. The system operated with remarkable efficiency, providing prisoners with limited autonomy while maintaining security protocols. The contrast with propaganda became increasingly difficult for Margaret to reconcile. She'd been taught that Americans valued only material wealth, that they were incapable of genuine organizational efficiency, that their treatment of prisoners would reflect the barbarism attributed to democratic societies in Nazi ideology. Instead, she encountered a system that was simultaneously rigid in its adherence to regulations and flexible in its practical implementation. Rules were enforced, but not arbitrarily. Discipline was maintained, but not through cruelty. She received letters from home through Red Cross channels. Stuttgart had been bombed repeatedly, her family's apartment destroyed, her father missing since the collapse of the Western Front. The letters were censored but allowed. She was permitted to respond, to send word that she was alive, adequately treated, awaiting repatriation. This communication channel represented another strategic calculation. Maintaining prisoner morale reduced management problems while demonstrating American respect for family connections that transcended wartime enmity. June brought the first repatriations. Small groups of German women POWs were processed for return to occupied Germany, beginning the massive logistical undertaking of returning millions of displaced persons to their homelands. Margaret wasn't in the first group. She waited, watching others depart, wondering what Germany would look like after total defeat. The stories filtering back through new arrivals painted pictures of devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, populations starving, occupation zones carved by Allied powers dividing the nation. In quiet moments, Margaret reflected on the peculiar nature of her captivity. The Americans had treated her feet, fed her adequately, provided clean clothing, maintained humane living conditions, and processed her case with bureaucratic efficiency that, while sometimes frustrating, never descended into deliberate cruelty. This treatment stood in stark contrast to what she'd heard about Soviet POW camps, where German prisoners faced brutal conditions, forced labor, and high mortality rates. The difference was profound and strategically calculated. The Western Allies understood that harsh treatment of POWs would poison post-war reconstruction efforts and validate communist propaganda about Western capitalism. The unexpected consequence of this humane treatment was a transformation in attitude among many German women POWs. Margaret found herself questioning not just specific propaganda claims, but the entire ideological framework she'd accepted during the war. If Americans were capable of this level of institutional humanity toward enemy prisoners, what other assumptions about democratic societies might be wrong? The question was deeply unsettling, undermining certainties that had structured her understanding of the world. By July, Camp Perry had processed over 200 German women POWs through its medical facilities. Captain Morrison's protocols had been adopted across multiple POW camps handling female prisoners. The systematic approach to foot care, seemingly mundane but critically important, had prevented potential epidemics while demonstrating American commitment to Geneva Convention standards. The strategic value of this commitment would become evident in subsequent years as West Germany emerged as a crucial Cold War ally. Its population, influenced partly by memories of how American forces had treated prisoners with dignity during the transition from war to peace. August 1945. Margarete Hoffmann boarded a transport ship in New York Harbor, bound for Bremerhaven in occupied Germany. Her captivity had lasted 4 months. She carried a small bag containing personal items accumulated during detention, photographs from home, letters from family, a dictionary she'd used to learn basic English from American guards who'd patiently corrected her pronunciation during work details. She also carried clean socks, a final issue before repatriation, symbolic of the systematic care that had defined her prisoner experience. The statistical impact of American POW policies was substantial. Over 371,000 German prisoners had been held in camps across the United States during the war. Mortality rate among German POWs in U.S. custody, 0.15%, one of the lowest in recorded military history. By contrast, German POW camps had maintained mortality rates exceeding 15% for Soviet prisoners and 4% for Western Allied prisoners. The contrast validated American claims to moral superiority while serving strategic purposes during post-war reconstruction. The humanitarian approach had immediate practical consequences. As Marshall Plan aid began flowing into West Germany in 1947, American administrators encountered populations whose attitudes toward U.S. occupation had been influenced partly by POW treatment experiences. Margarete herself became an example of this transformation. Returning to Stuttgart in August 1945, she found her hometown in ruins, but rebuilding under American military government. She secured employment as interpreter for U.S. occupation forces, using English skills developed during captivity to facilitate communication between American administrators and German civilians. Her testimony about POW treatment, shared informally with neighbors, relatives, and community members, contributed to broader acceptance of American occupation. "They treated us according to regulations," she explained when asked about her captivity. "They examined our feet, gave us medicine, fed us adequately, allowed us to write home. They could have been cruel. They chose not to be." And this simple statement, repeated in countless conversations across post-war Germany, helped establish foundations for U.S.-West German alliance that would become crucial during Cold War confrontation with Soviet power. Captain Morrison returned to Philadelphia in November 1945, resuming civilian medical practice. He never publicly discussed his POW camp service, viewing it as routine execution of professional obligations under military regulations. His approach, systematic, humane, efficient, had been replicated by hundreds of American medical personnel processing POW populations. The collective impact of these individual professional decisions demonstrated how institutional culture could translate abstract principles about human dignity into concrete practices that served both moral and strategic purposes. The broader legacy extended beyond individual transformations. American treatment of German POWs became case study in military ethics courses, examined as example of how nations could maintain humanitarian standards even while fighting total war against enemy that had systematically violated such standards. The contrast between American adherence to Geneva Conventions and Axis practices of prisoner abuse became central element in post-war narrative about democratic values versus totalitarian barbarism. By 1950, most German POWs had been repatriated. Small numbers remained in custody due to war crimes investigations or complex legal cases, but the mass return had been completed with remarkable efficiency. The logistical accomplishment was impressive. Millions of prisoners transported across oceans, processed through documentation systems, returned to homelands while maintaining security protocols and humanitarian standards. The operation demonstrated American institutional capacity for massive undertakings, requiring sustained coordination between military, diplomatic, and civilian agencies. The final vindication came in 1990 with German reunification. West Germany's successful post-war reconstruction, enabled partly by American aid, protected by American military presence, shaped by democratic institutions, championed by American occupation authorities, stood in stark contrast to East Germany's stagnation under Soviet control. The difference reflected choices made during immediate post-war period, when American decision to treat German prisoners and civilians with dignity despite recent enmity had laid foundations for alliance that would endure through Cold War and beyond. Margaret died in 2003 at age 81, having witnessed transformation of Germany from totalitarian aggressor to democratic ally. In her final years, she occasionally spoke with grandchildren about the war, emphasizing the unexpected kindness she'd encountered in American captivity. "They didn't have to treat us well," she explained. "They could have been cruel and still followed the rules, but they chose decency. That choice changed everything. For me, for Germany, for the world that came after." The story of Camp Perry's foot inspections represents something fundamental about how wars end and peaces begin. Military victory alone doesn't ensure successful post-war reconstruction. The manner of victory matters. The treatment of defeated populations shapes their willingness to accept new political arrangements. American decision to maintain humanitarian standards toward German POWs, demonstrated through actions as mundane as medical foot care, served both moral imperatives and strategic calculations, proving that decency and effectiveness need not be opposing values. This story reveals how an unexpected act of compassion changed history, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons are clean socks and professional medical care. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II, where ordinary people made extraordinary choices that shaped our modern world. Drop a comment about what surprised you most about this story. What would you have done?